Alright, so for this, we're going to do something a little bit different. I think for a lot of the other videos I do with the Evo or the Porsche, I want to spend a little bit more time and kind of digging into some of the technical things that, depending on your level of knowledge, you may not have had exposure to. So I want to start this as kind of like an educational series. And in this one, I'm just going to kick it off with something that was recently on talking about the Evo, and that is dynos. And I know you may have come across it if you're into cars, but maybe you kind of always wonder, well, how does it work and why are there different types and, what really even makes a dyno? So for that, we're going to dig right into it and start with the types of dynos. There are really three main types to talk about. And the first one we're going to talk about is what's called the engine dyno. The engine dyno, it's completely separate from the car. There's not even a transmission. You take the engine out, you put it in a closed cell, you plumb water to it for your coolant, you give it fresh air, you pull the exhaust out. Everything's a very controlled environment. This is awesome for tuning or for setting up an engine. Manufacturers use these, high-end engine builders will use these. It's a very, very great way of removing variables. And whenever you're testing or experimenting or doing anything, the less variables you have, the better you can dial something in. So an engine dyno, it's the best. It really is an amazing way to get the perfect tune on an engine. And now with that being said, I'm going to be quiet for a second so you can listen to this. Now, that is from the glory days of F1 and these engines. Oh my gosh. Come on, bring it back. Listen to this. It just sounds But yeah, that's an engine dyno, and you can see the level of control these engineers have with modifying and tuning the parameters and simulating anything you want. It's the best tool. It really is. An engine, and the trouble is it's difficult. It's expensive to kind of pull an engine out of a car every time you want to tune it. So you'll pretty much only see high-end builds, high-end race teams, or manufacturers doing this. The second one to talk about is kind of an in-between option. It's called the hub dyno. And the hub dyno, what you do is you take the wheels off the car, and you only need to do this on the drive wheels. So here we got an Evo, so we need all four off. And what you do then is you actually bolt the dynos directly to the hubs. So they kind of bolt on where the wheels go. And the car is actually floating in the air. And what this is able to do is, again, we're taking out variables. So now we don't have the issue of potentially wheels slipping on the dyno. We don't have an issue of, the squat mechanics and the suspension that you run into on a roller dyno. But it's just a bit more setup. Alright, and here's a quick example of a rear-wheel drive setup over at Morris Racing Engines. So there's something serious under that hood. And what's going to be cool is another little key factor that these can do is they're going to simulate a full launch. So the car's going to go on its trans brake, it's going to load up, and then just going to fly. So it's super cool to see that. But I'll be quiet too. That's awesome. That's so cool, man. That sounds great. But it's a bit more work, to kind of a bit more of a faff to get it all set up. But once you do, it's really nice to tune it. The other benefit is it has a much more potential for horsepower. So I think it's like north of 2,000 horsepower you can tune on these things, obviously depending on the specs. But when we talk about the third type, the roller dyno, this one's the most common though. This one's one you're going to see everywhere because you pretty much just have to roll the vehicle up onto the dyno, strap it down, give it some fans on the front, and then have an exhaust fan on the back side, and then you can basically pull the car right off again. So we gotta listen to something. So let's throw on the Evo to the dyno and give you a little something to listen to. Now, without a doubt, the lowest horsepower thing on this video, but still something to look at and of how a roller dyno operates. What's nice about this is it's very easy to set up. It's pull the car and pull the car off. Setup time 15 minutes or so. But the flip side is it's got some problems, as I mentioned before. You can overcome the rollers themselves. So you have traction limitations, and that kind of realistic limit is somewhere in the 1,000 horsepower range. Once you start to cross that, you start to basically overcome those rollers pretty easily, and you'll see like videos people sometimes burn out in the dynos, depending on how much power comes in. So maybe a big torquey V8 could potentially upset that traction and actually burn out on a dyno, which is pretty wild. The other problem you run into is the squat mechanic. So you'll see in the video, as the car accelerates in the dyno, it kind of pulls that back end down. This is because it's fighting those straps. The car is literally want to launch off the dyno. It wants to go, but those straps are pulling it down. So the car's up squatting. So you'll run into issues where like tires will contact fenders, or things will just, it's not quite great. You can also get into some issues if you have a lot of suspension travel, thinking about like trophy trucks or some pretty crazy wild things out there. You can get weird issues with even the drive shaft angles in those universal joints. So you can get some weird stuff happening on those where you wouldn't get that on a hub dyno. But the main feature is ease of use. And honestly, for 99% of the use cases, it's fine. It works great. You know, how many cars are really out there making 1,000 horsepower? And I'm not talking about like YouTube bragging right horsepower, like actually making it. So most cars, roller dynos are great. You'll find them locally, and because of that, that's what we're going to spend the most time talking about today. So first, let's talk about the general setup, and got some cool little graphics here we're just going to go through. And yes, so you pull the vehicle up on those rollers, you strap it down, and the drive wheels themselves, the car, gears running through, power runs out of the engine, through the transmission, through the drivetrain, into those rollers, and those rollers spin with the wheels. And what it's doing is it's going to use a dyno and the spinning of those rollers to then measure the torque and then the RPM of those rollers to come up with the data we need for our dyno. So how's it doing that? Well, simply put, there's a load cell. And the load cell, that's the main part of a dyno. And what that's doing is it's basically taking the force, the torque, being applied by the vehicle on those rollers, and it's taking that torque and measuring it along with the RPM of the rollers to give us the data we need. And then I'll get the horsepower in a second. But that's the main thing, is we're calculating torque via that load cell, that force being applied. And here's a picture of the load cell there on the left. And on the right is the next thing we're going to talk about. This is called the eddy current retarder. Essentially, it's something you'll find on roller coasters or other sort of environments, but think of it like an electromagnetic brake. It's a way to control the roller speed at whatever rate you want. You want to hold that at a certain RPM, as much force as you apply, you can do that. You want to do a power run and run it from 2,000 to 7,000 RPMs over the course of 15 seconds, 20 seconds, 40 seconds, whatever. It gives you the ability to do that, which is phenomenal when it comes to trying to dial in a car. If you have some strange dead spots sitting there right when you tip into boost and you're trying to figure out what's going on with that, and you get that exact RPM, you can do that with a dyno. You can't really do that easily on a street. So now we come into the sensors themselves and a little bit more about torque and RPM. And I mentioned that before, is we're just measuring torque and RPM with the sensors. So then your next question is probably, okay, well, hold on a second. Wait, what about horsepower? That's like the number, right? It's the bragging number. I've got more horsepower than you have. That's the whole point, isn't it? Well, fun fact, horsepower is just a calculation from a dyno. It's a very basic calculation, actually. Torque is what really is the driving force, if you will, that vehicles should really be kind of judged by in that sense. But horsepower kind of comes as another measurement that's purely from calculation. And what is that calculation? It's kind of complicated, so get your pencils out. Ready? It's torque times the RPM divided by 52. So, yeah, tricky. But that's actually, if you think about that number, maybe some keen-eyed people have experienced this in the past, but if you ever see a dyno chart, horsepower and torque, they always cross each other. If you notice, they always cross each other at a certain RPM. It's part of the mathematical calculation. They always cross 52. That's just part of it. So if you have kind of a cool little fun fact of, hey, why do they always cross? There he is. There's your answer. So then all that information gets outputted on the dyno graph that you'll see. And this information is then combined with what is coming from the vehicle. So what you often see is a tuner sitting there with the laptop plugged into a vehicle, pulling in a bunch of data, doing a dyno run, the tuner's watching the dyno output, then going back to the ECU and making adjustments. Now, the amount of information coming from the vehicle is a lot more complicated than what we're talking about with dynos. And there's a lot to get into, and it varies dramatically, depending on even if you're talking about like manufacturers, if you're talking about emissions testing, if you're talking about certifications, if you're talking about just performance tuning. Varies dramatically what you're doing, what you're monitoring, what you're playing with. So we won't go into that in detail, let's just focus purely on the dyno, but that's what the output of the dyno is doing. It's simply a repeated test bed for the user to make adjustments or readings. And that's why when we talk about the three types of dynos, I focused on variables. Because when we think about test beds, the more variables we can remove, the less variables we have, the better. That gives us more repeatable results. And that brings us to something we haven't talked about yet. And this is sometimes it comes up in the internet comments when someone's complaining about a horsepower output or something. And that is the correction factor. The correction factor is a way of taking the output of the dyno and adjusting it based off of temperature, humidity, and altitude. And what you do typically is adjust it to a standard. Now, there's an old standard. I think STD is abbreviation for the oldest one. I don't really think anybody uses that anymore. SAE is pretty much the gold standard now. And what that tries to do is basically brings everything to a norm. That way, when I look at a horsepower number from one thing, I can compare it to another thing much easier. And I think the SAE standard is about 77 degrees Fahrenheit. It's 0% humidity, and I think 29 inches of mercury for altitude. But that way we can have a bit more of a standard conversation around outputs of a dyno. And that's the main correction factor. There's also some more complicated formulas, but not really going into it in too much detail here. But it's simply something to understand that, yes, a correction factor can be adjusted manually on a dyno as well. So someone can sit there and put a correction factor of 2 in there if they want, and suddenly they're 100 horsepower Civic is making 200 horsepower at the wheels. So yes, there is some tomfoolery that can happen with the correction factor, so keep that in mind. But correction factors, usually you'll find them in the 1.0 something range. That's kind of normal. The other thing we haven't talked about is kind of coast down. This is another thing that a dyno will do sometimes, and you'll hear this actually auditorially a lot of times in the dyno. When you hear the car ramp up for the first time, builds up, and then he lets off, and the car very slowly coasts down. Not a quick one, really coast down pretty fast. This is actually a measurement that the dyno can do as well. It's basically doing coast down, but not super relevant for what we're talking about today and just kind of the general understanding of dynos. But I hope that gave you guys a little bit of an insight. Maybe you learned something today. Maybe you want to dig into more details about something. I'm happy to go into it. But yeah, that kind of shows what the three main types are, what the main thing a dyno is measuring, and a little bit about a dyno's output. And kind of going back to, it's a test bed. It's an experimental tool. And our goal is, in this experiment, to remove as many variables as possible. So that's why when you see things like, hey, we're doing an upgrade, or we're going to do a before and after, you're going to want that on the same day, as close to the same time, same vehicle conditions, and the same dyno. So that's why we think about this as an experimental tool. It's all about removing variables. And when you do things like that and change it up, you're adding variables and you're obfuscating the results of that. So from that's why we also have those three types, with the roller dyno, being the quick and dirty one. It works for most environments. Pretty much it gets the job done, but it's got a lot of variables. The hub type, hey, pulls a variable out. That's nice. We have, like I said, we talk about squat, we talk about slip, but the best is the engine dyno. If you're doing something professionally, if you are working for an OEM, you're using engine dynos. They are the way to go. You can control the variables. You can do all sorts of really cool, fun stuff. The videos out there, like Formula One teams singing national anthems with their engines on engine dynos. So it's pretty cool stuff you can do with those. But anyways, if there's something you want to learn more about, it's something that I could dig into, I'd love to make a video about it. Just let me know.